Ali, I've always been fascinated with global soft power, and I was getting my hair cut the other day, and the gentleman that cuts my hair reminded me that how Korea has taken over China in the soft power places. I mean, he's a barber, and he was talking about the fact that K-pop Demon Hunters and Blackpink and all these things make Korea much more attractive on the soft power rankings. But he's actually not correct. The Global Soft Power Index, which was released in 2025, ranks China at number 2, right behind the US. And by the way, Korea on these soft power rankings is number 12. So China is now right behind the US.
Maybe Labubu. It's just over-index Chinese soft power.
Yeah, maybe they're over-indexing. Maybe it's the Labubu factor. Well, I think it's going to be more than just Labubu. Is China's rise in the rankings the result of government intervention and top-down mandates? We normally think that that's what the case is, that China is trying to build its soft power rankings. Or are we seeing a massive cultural breakout fueled by something more organic, fueled by digital platforms maybe? Are there platforms creating what scholar Henry Jenkins coined cultural convergence? How, despite all these constraints, is China seemingly rewriting the rules about global influence? So that's our topic today. And to discuss this, we are joined by Brian Wong. He's the chairman and founder of Radii Media. Brian is an entrepreneur, investor, and author whose career has spanned e-commerce, education, and digital media. Brian, by the way, Ali, was the first American and second employee of the Alibaba Group in 1999. That could be a podcast in itself, seriously. That would be great. I've always thought about what it would have been like in those days, probably working in an apartment somewhere in Hangzhou. He wrote a best-selling book about his experience called The Tao of Alibaba, and I'll post the link on the show notes. So Radii is a leading digital media company dedicated to bridging the understanding between youth in the East and the West. I also put the link on the show notes. It's a fantastic website. It's just so much fun to read. Brian, welcome to Shanghai Zhan.
Hey, thanks, guys. Great to be here.
So Brian, let's start off. Just tell us a little about Radii, what it is, and how does it measure China youth culture? What's the model?
Sure. Radii was founded about 8 years ago. I actually started it when I was at Alibaba, partly because I was quite frustrated with the growing disconnect of understanding between the US and China with regard to what was happening around technology. I mean, there was so much change happening at that time. This was about 2017 in terms of the progress being made in the tech space, but so many people in the US were not paying attention, nor were they giving it the proper recognition that I thought it deserved and warranted, both for good and bad reasons. But at the same time, I said, what's the problem here? And the problem really seemed to be this lack of effective communication and lack of windows into what was happening in China on the ground. That growing disconnect, however, I think then started to become more of a political sort of dynamic where there was a lot of mistrust. There was a sudden change in perceptions of Americans towards the Chinese country as a whole. And I said, what's the best way to bridge this lack of understanding? Media is an effective tool. At that time, social media was really exploding, but I said, what do we want to put in on the internet that allows people to better understand on a nuanced level what's happening in China? And I thought youth culture, the foundation of kind of how we understand one another vis-a-vis this things that people were interested in: food, film, fashion, technology, even wellness, were all topics that could help better facilitate that understanding.
I guess, why do you think China is now number 2 in terms of global soft power? Not number 12, that's Korea, which we'd normally think would be up there because of all its consumer pop culture stuff. Why is China number 2 in the rankings? What's attributing to this?
Well, look, I think a big part of it's a holistic sort of approach to how people see a country. Obviously, K-pop is booming. K-pop Demon Hunters, BTS, Blackpink, all of that is big. But that's like one aspect of kind of how maybe people view a country. I think what China has done in the last 40 years is really become a country or a society that represents so many changes that people are paying attention to. One is how they've grown economically. 2 is how they are projecting their culture sort of beyond their borders with regard to food, of course, is a very common sort of familiarity with international people. But more importantly, the technology, the cars that they're developing,
Mhm.
the sort of platforms that they're creating. E-commerce is a big one, the payment systems that they've created. And then I think, in between all of that is really just kind of what China has done with its society, the way it operates, the way that people see they're addressing issues like poverty, like renewable energy, climate change. These were all negative things, I think, for many years when people thought of China. But now, in the last, say, 20 years in particular, there's been a huge shift in how China has addressed these issues. It's shown the progress, but also how people then are perceiving the country.
Absolutely. Even in the US, the
Mm.
demographic generational changes about positive perception of China are remarkably different. If you are under 25 years old, your positive impressions of China are off the charts versus someone who's over 50. It's massive. And it's just interesting the dynamics of that. In your article that you wrote, which I loved, you
Thank you.
talk about this combination of top down and bottom up. Can you explain that? How does that impact the cultural relevance or cultural changes within China? Is there a state control that's fostering this kind of changes? And what's the bottom up aspect of it?
Sure. I think both factors, top down, bottom up, are at play when we think about China's growing soft power. But I don't think any culture or any soft power is successful if it's just a top down endeavor. Culture is something that really emerges from the grassroots. But when we talk about top down as relates to government, I think there are certain things within their national agenda that have helped facilitate the emergence of China's growing influence, particularly, I would say, with regard to infrastructure. And that's not just, say, hard infrastructure like roads and bridges and trains, but also in terms of the digital economy, creating an internet system that is efficient in terms of how it operates, providing the right sort of environment for the facilitation of things like I mentioned, e-commerce, and even video sort of production, video streaming. These have not only been successful in China in terms of creating vibrant ecosystems, but what you see is those quote unquote infrastructures or these platforms are also being exported globally. So, when you think about e-commerce, the best e-commerce systems are actually those that were created in China vis-a-vis Alibaba, even Pinduoduo, which is the creator of Temu. These have made e-commerce accessible and low cost to the entire world. When you think about and then the video streaming platforms and even the video editing tools that China has, like CapCut and many of these others. But if you think about then from the bottom up with regard to the creation and the creativity and the content creation, that is something that has been originated from the grassroots. And part of that is just the youth is so much more vibrant and exposed to international ideas and concepts, but also they themselves have embraced these platforms and created novel and unique sort of content and even products. Like you guys mentioned Labubu at the beginning, or their video game production. All of this has blossomed, and the infrastructure, the platforms themselves have allowed this to disperse globally.
I wonder, with ByteDance, and they were kind of the flag bearer of a lot of discontent. And I wonder if the more negative governments are towards ByteDance, the more positive people are towards ByteDance, and therefore that has kind of it has a cascading kind of an effect on soft power and how China is perceived internationally. Do you think there's a little bit of role in TikTok and how the platforms kind of permeated through culture as well in the US and around the world?
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Ali. I mean, youth, in a way, they're rebellious by nature. So when you try and stop something, they're naturally going to tell you, get out of the way or stop ruining the party. Because TikTok is something that I think youth embrace because it brought a whole different experience to their lives. It also brought content that they had never seen before. Bryce, I'm sure you're going to ask me about this concept of algorithmic cosmopolitanism. And I'd say that, TikTok is really at the heart of that, which is really this concept of our cosmopolitanism in the past has been a traditional one where we've been introduced to new concepts around the world vis-a-vis traditional media, government sort of programming and propaganda, and, sort of traditional tourism. But what happens with platforms like TikTok is the algorithm is what determines what we all see. And the algorithm is based on your perceived preference of what you like to see with the intention of trying to drive more engagement. And so this is a non-political sort of metric in that you're trying to just drive engagement with the platform. So if you like furry, fluffy pets, they're going to bring you pets from not just the US, but, people who have pets in China or from wherever else in the world. And I think when you try and take these things from the youth who are enjoying it, they're actually using it as a form of expression and they're learning things from it, they're naturally going to rebel and be upset about that.
I really wish I could get some of those fun things in my algorithm. Nowadays, I'm getting portable urinals, portable auto urinals. Like when you're driving somewhere and you can't stop to pee, you have I don't know how that got into my feed, but I've just been inundated with portable urinals. And damn, actually, I have to say, that's not a bad idea, by the way, that I can just pee in my car into a little bag. But anyway, that's coming into my,
Bryce, I'll have to take a look at your feed and give you some comments, but it's hard for me to comment from here.
Do you think it also has to do with the fact that in many aspects, we're living in a world now that culture is now democratized and that we're not looking at we talked about this last week with Bassam, but we have the Bad Bunny and the Taylor Swifts, but in a sense, those are exceptional cases. Most of the time now, culture is very grassroots. It's something that anybody could actually create and participate and develop. And there's probably no better examples in China. Can you think of one in China that comes to mind where it's a completely crazy grassroots thing? Some dude somewhere in some far off province got into something and it just kind of took off. I would assume that there's hundreds of examples of that.
Well, yeah, there's tons. And I agree. This is very much a grassroots thing now where I think people, while they like, polished and kind of high production value performances, a lot of what youth are seeking now is authenticity and kind of just content that it really shares what people are truly thinking, not something that's been overly staged. China, there's a lot of that. There's a lot of these cultural movements that are emerging either from subcultures that are not kind of your immediately apparent, whatever, boy bands and like pop culture type things. They're more subculture marginal groups. So I agree with the statement that culture is really sort of a grassroots sort of thing. And despite the fact that a lot of people enjoy kind of this more high production value, sort of polished type of entertainment, I would say that in China, in many parts of the world amongst the youth, they're looking for something more authentic. So in China, I'd say a lot of the cultural movements that you're seeing, particularly in the online sphere, are from subcultures within the urban space. These fashion movements that are not mainstream, but they're actually things that are kind of emerging at the fringes. Fashion movements like what they call yabi. That's like yabi is a term that describes this mix of goth plus other international elements that doesn't quite have a clear definition in the fashion world, the mainstream fashion world, but it's a way that youth are mixing and matching things from their own sort of experience, but also international sort of styles. And that's something that is definitely a grassroots movement. Influences from kind of third, fourth tier, there's a countryside aesthetic where people are actually looking back and romanticizing what it means to live in kind of the rural areas, right? There's other sort of cultural movements, like there's a group called the Ghost Fire Boys, these are migrant laborers who are living in cities who soup up motor scooters and dye their hair, and they go buzzing around town doing really dangerous sort of acrobatics on these things. But it's a way for them to to reflect their own sort of expression and their courage, and these are all sort of fringe movements that become kind of phenomenon in themselves.
Yeah, riding motorcycles is already something quite rebellious in China. I mean, for listeners, it's not one of the easiest places. I've driven a motorcycle for a number of years in Shanghai.
That's in your delivery days, right? When you were at Meituan, that was in your delivery days, Ali.
Getting a number plate is just exorbitantly expensive. So I can totally see it. If you're a blue collar worker that's living in one of the larger cities, and your only form of expression is just souping up your Yamaha, which needs to be lower than a certain CC, and entertainment is riding out just with music blasting and all kinds of strobe lights around it. That I can totally see that as a form of expression. That's something very nuanced in China, and it can only exist in that country because of all the restrictions around two-wheeled vehicles.
They're working within the confines.
I have to plug an article I wrote in the Journal of Internet
Please.
Commerce. I wrote about interviewed Chinese and American students about their social commerce behaviors. And one of the hypotheses I made was that we should pay attention to what's happening in China because it is the future of the world in some aspects in terms of how consumers behave, and that we are just seeing this play off because of the platforms, are migrating to different countries. And oftentimes my students will ask me, well, why does TikTok do this? Why does it do that? And I tell them because it is copying what it's done successfully in China and now is exporting that to the world. Do you think that the reason that we should follow, or at least should pay attention to these cultural changes that are happening in China, is because that we'll see them somewhere down the pipeline in the West in another format?
Good
Yeah,
question.
Bryce, I think that's a fair point. China, everyone, who's been here sees it's a hyper competitive market. So what you have is, iterations and iterations of insight and experience from those who have kind of tried to be successful in this hyper competitive market. And they've proven a model that works here in the end after going through all that. And more likely than not, many of those lessons, not all of them, but many of those lessons are going to be beneficial to going overseas to other markets. And, whether it's optimizing the sales flow or the conversion flow, whether it's optimizing the efficiency of the production to achieve the lowest cost to make the product, whether it's, the UI in terms of how intelligent the interface is that they create in their checkout sort of flow, like all these things are going to be useful when they're looking at other markets and trying to expand in those markets. And so across the board, whether it's in, e-commerce, whether it's in the EV cars that they make, whether it's in their production of plush toys and the costs, or let's say the sales model, the blind box approach, all of those things are advantages, or how shall we say, tools by which they can compete in the overseas markets in a way that they've benefited from the China domestic experience.
Yeah, I was recently showing some examples of Chinese live stream. I know that you mentioned on your platform about the Tuanbo as the group live streaming is another example, which is just outrageous to me. The group live streaming experiences, but essentially that there are so many different forms of live streaming in China, not just the classic Li Jiaqi type of Austin Lee type format, but there are just so many different types and the way to look at it. And I remember showing my students an example of a Zara catwalk thing where they did a live stream show with a fashion show. And I showed this video to them and I said, would you watch this? And they said, absolutely, that's fantastic. And there's just so many different ways that they're experimenting and being able to take something that we'd normally see as extremely mundane and turning it into a cultural icon. I love the platform in the U.S. It's a U.S.-based platform called Whatnot. I don't know if you've heard about that. It's just a fascinating live stream platform, which has literally taken elements of Chinese live streaming and then adapted it to an American audience. And I think that we're just going to see a lot of those things where there are elements that could say, hey, this could definitely work. And I would think that brands and cultural creators and people could easily learn from these things and be able to see what works and what doesn't work. And this is more than just the plush toys and the the bubble teas. I think that there's a lot more things that's exportable.
Well, Bryce, for sure. I mean, now I think the next level is these avatars. I mean, I know AI and all this is huge in the US, but what China's done well with AI already is integrated it and diffused it into e-commerce at a rate that I know there's already, and it's been for some time, these channels that are using AI avatars that are selling 24 hours a day that you would not even know are not human. They're already powering a lot of their live stream sales using these, and so they not only so they pioneer a lot of use cases when it comes to this technology and the innovation in areas like e-commerce.
Just a question, and maybe I just want to make sure that I understand correctly. Are we saying that the export of Chinese technology to the rest of the world is what's driving soft power then, primarily?
I think that's one component. I mean, the other component that's happened is, the youth have sort of been unleashed in terms of their ability to create, and this creation is unique in that initially, before the advent of all this low cost production technology, it was big studios that were creating content that was heavily regulated by government sort of policies and even
Correct.
censors domestically. And now it's just youth creating stuff that they think is interesting and cool and fun. What you had not only with the advent of TikTok is when you had the threatening of the shutting down of TikTok, you had this jumping of the firewall, this reversal where Americans were like, okay, we're not going to be able to watch TikTok. What do we watch? We don't want to go to like the normal US platforms. What's this thing called Red Note? And that was a very interesting phenomenon that took place where Americans started to go on to native Chinese social media platforms. And what they saw there blew their minds because it had never really reached US audiences to this extent. I mean, not only was it like the technology, like whether it's the robots or the EV cars and how amazing and
But the
advanced these
content.
things already were, but also it was things like the grocery stores. I remember seeing some stuff from Americans like, oh my gosh, they have this much food and it's that cheap. And, how does China have all this
Abundance.
abundance of things? And what you realized was that there was a perception of China, probably dated back in the 1970s and 80s, people in Mao suits
Yeah.
and, repressive governments that people can't express themselves and the kids are not having fun. They're just studying and like it's this dark, bleak
Eating
life. And
mantou.
suddenly eating mantou, with coal burning factories in the background. And suddenly it's like, oh my gosh, this is a whole different world I never realized. So this opening of the floodgates of a new world, a discovery, I think also piqued people's curiosity. And then suddenly this realization that there was a whole different world to explore. And so I think it's a combination of things, the platforms, but also a realization of particularly the youth. That's why when you cited those statistics, I
Definitely.
think there is a cutoff like around 35, 40, where the perceptions of China over 40 are majority negative. But if you look under, say, 40 or 35 years old, I'd say that there's a much more positive leaning towards China because of this curiosity.
I
No,
agree with
they
that.
even at my school, they have these global tours. They
Yep.
take students to different countries, and the students actually asked me proactively, which they've never done before, can we take a group to China? And it's so interesting to hear what their
Yeah.
perceptions are and what they're curious about in terms of the culture there. And you're right, it's just not going to a particular retailer, going to an automated factory, seeing technology and how it works and how that able to, I always told them like how we could buy cocktails through Meituan or Ulama and have them delivered to the agency in 30 minutes, right in time for
Oh
them.
yeah, I
Just
agree.
things like that where they can see this automation and stuff. They just kind of want to feel like what that's
Yeah.
like. In many aspects, it was that experience when I was in the 80s when I went to Japan. And when people
Mhm.
describe Japan to me as this infrastructural marvel that you realized setting foot there that you really did grow up in a third world country called the United States. And essentially I still probably get that feeling when I even now to China, I go back, it's like, gosh, this is like, why can't America be like this? So
I remember growing up, people always talked about Swiss precision in terms of not just the watches, but the train system, right? But now you go to China and you see just how precise that whole operation is with the high-speed trains. It makes you realize, wow, I mean, a lot has changed in terms of, infrastructure between countries.
I'm just gonna add something, and I wonder if this is a thought, and feel free to latch on it and see how it translates into some of your thinking as well. Because one of the things that you said earlier, and it just struck me that, China is like this big experiment. It just lives in its sandbox, right? And the proof points are that, a lot of Western film, as an example, there's restrictions to the number of movies, or to the volume of entertainment that can come in from overseas. There's restriction on the number of concerts that you can have in China. Obviously they're very strict on who gets a chance to take on stage. I remember being in China once upon a time when, during the first hour, like you had to sit down. You just had to sit in your seat, and it was usually the second hour when the chaperones would leave the hall, and everyone kind of stood up and started to dance. No,
That was way back.
yeah, it's way back. It's way back.
Wow.
And no, but I'm getting, like, when you think of China Voice and you think of the hip hop franchise, we have to give it to China to be able to export its soft power within the confines of that sandbox. And I guess what I'm trying to get to is that it's got to be very, very unique. And taking your word, it's got to be super authentic, because in other markets, if you go to Korea, there's a lot of cross-border between Korea and the US. Baseball is super popular there, et cetera, K-pop, all of that. But whatever China exports is uniquely, thoroughly Chinese, and there's no other way to define it. So if anyone really enjoys Chinese culture, they're getting a fairly unfiltered view into the world of young people and Gen Z and what's happening in this market. I just had to put that on the table, because like any other country, it's not going to be like that.
Ali, I think you're highlighting a great point. There's probably two forces at work here. One is the novelty and the uniqueness of the culture, the grassroots culture that's emerging from China vis-a-vis all these channels we talked about, whether it's the platforms, whether it's through the technology, whether it's through just jumping the firewall and discovering it haphazardly or accidentally or algorithmically. Those are definitely the things that are happening. I think in addition to that, it's, and some people have talked about this in the recent media, is Americans are seeking or yearning for something that they don't have any longer. Whether that's like, the stability of the lives, when America was at a peaceful time, when it was like, people are interested in all these health practices in China, TCM, and like drinking hot water and like eating certain hot and, yin yang foods, right? It's like, these are all the things that maybe they are seeking in their lives at this moment, but not finding in America. And suddenly China becomes an alternative. And one thing I didn't write about in this article, but I do talk about on occasion is, Chinese culture is actually not that foreign to American history or culture if we really look back at it. The Transcendental Movement, Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau actually studied Taoism and Confucianism. And as a response to the growing capitalism in that period of time, the late 18th century, they started to embrace Eastern culture, even Buddhism and Hinduism. And so, in a way, American sort of psyche, sometimes in different periods when they're not finding what they're looking for within their own culture, they look elsewhere. And right now what's happening is that China is providing answers to many of the questions that are not being addressed in their country. And that becomes a convenient sort of alternative. That's how I see it, at least.
I love it. I like it. I like it a lot. That explains also the point that you made earlier, Bryce. Like, everyone's looking at sustainability, and China's offering options in the form of EVs. Right, in the form of just solar panels, right? So anyone that wants to wire up their home, you've got an answer, and that answer is coming from China, and that's the software we're talking about.
Yes.
In terms of entertainment, same thing, right? If you've got little dolls that, like Barbie's being replaced by Labubu, so all of that just seems to be, there's a lot of things then, if you really think about it, there's a lot of things that are replacing what would be traditional forms of entertainment, and that's all being exported out of China. I never thought about it like that, but now that I think of it like that, it's really exciting.
Well, even Labubus, like, sorry, just to add on to that, a lot of people talked about that and referred to as the lipstick effect, right? Like when the economy is not good and you need to have these little purchases that psychologically make you feel better. That's happening across the world, right? Everybody's facing economic pressure right now, and they're tightening their purse strings. When it comes to like buying those things that make you feel good, but not having to put out too much money, suddenly Labubu is fulfilling that need, not only in China, but all over the world. And so, yeah, it's all part of the same thing. Yeah.
It's so fascinating that there's so many historical references to this happening throughout time. It was not only the exportability of Chinese language in the Tang Dynasty, why what the start of the Opium War was, is because people wanted Chinese stuff. That
Yeah.
China, which is what we call plates and dishes, is really
Yeah. Yeah.
that aspect that everyone in Europe had a set of China, and
That's
that
right.
came from China. So this is just
So true.
happening again. I see it even, I mean, I'm living in Chicago, and to really see soft power in the consumer side of things is to go to Chinatown on a weekend here. There are over 50, 60 different Chinese restaurants, but all the toys, all the desserts, the bubble teas, there's 7 bubble teas. They just opened up. I just couldn't believe this. They opened up a Sanxian, the Taiwanese, the high-end tea shop. They're
Yes.
$9 for a bubble tea, $9 for a bubble tea. There's a line out the door
Yeah.
for this place. It's nuts. And just the fact that they can package this entertainment day out kind of experience where people have nothing to do and go on the weekends and go to Chinatown. It's affordable. There's all these different types of experiences that can take place. Do you, Brian, like with Radii, and you're in looking inwards now?
Yes.
I'm a Western brand in China. How can we effectively use your insights and research to latch on to cultural things? I know you mentioned the Hanfu movement. You talk about what Adidas did with the clothes.
Yes.
Let's say I'm selling some kind of product or something. How can I take advantage of this and being able to latch on to something that's a cultural artifact or some kind of cool nuance, and we can take advantage of this? How do you provide that kind of service?
Sure. We are trend spotters, I guess you can say. We try and understand the psyche of Chinese youth vis-a-vis how they're expressing themselves on the internet, but also how they're purchasing, how they're dressing themselves, how they're being creative in the things that they do. And so we want to provide a window into what's happening with Chinese youth culture and in larger Asia also, for that matter. And so you can read our stuff. We're on Instagram, our website, stay on top of these things. But then, we work with brands. We work with companies to help them understand how to translate that into content, right? That travels. Now, we do work with international companies that are trying to enter the China market, but we also work with Chinese companies that are trying to go global, right? We go both ways. And most importantly, though, is we try and inform and educate these brands about our insights on the trends that are taking place in the local market.
So do you think some of these trends are exportable for brands? That some of the things that you're seeing is there are certain elements that brands, some, let's say, newer trends or some kind of small nuggets of things that people haven't seen before, that brands could effectively take advantage of this and export this type of cultural nuance to let's say a European market, for example.
So are you talking about European brands learning from the Chinese companies' approach, or just the China market and then applying those to the European market?
I was thinking more about like Chinese brands themselves. I think one of the challenges that Chinese brands have is that they are, yes, they're prolific, they're everywhere, but they're actually pretty poor brand marketers.
Yes.
But they have goofy names that are unpronounceable sometimes. That packaging, poor imagery. I mean, they're just not spending the money.
Yeah.
They spend a hell of a lot of money to get Facebook impressions, but at the same time, they're not really marketing themselves very well. Is it something that they should take from their roots within China and export that, or are you recommending to them you're marketing, you're selling your products into Europe, you have to become more European?
Yeah. So you definitely need the contextual sort of awareness to be successful and to be relevant to your audience. So yes, if you're thinking about how do you go China to the world, we do work with brands and consult them in terms of how do you contextualize your brand in a European market setting or a US market setting? How do you use sort of reference points that will help the consumer better understand who you are or what you're trying to do? We generally will do that in terms of, we work with them to create content, short videos, social media posts, and then also give them some input in terms of larger sort of brand strategy. All of those things we do. And I think that's where the greatest value add is because Chinese companies, they use a certain approach in the domestic market. But when you're trying to sell to a US consumer, right, you need to understand what is their sort of frame of reference and how do you explain the value proposition of your product to them vis-a-vis what they need in their lives or their situation.
So it's more of a consulting offer. It's the example that Bryce made earlier, where Adidas they went Hanfu on this really popular
jacket,
almost like a Mao. It's not really a Mao jacket. It's a nice jacket. It's a nice looking jacket. Everyone's wearing. Everyone in Shanghai.
It's a Tang style jacket.
Style jacket. There you go. But how far would you where would you sit in that process?
Well, I mean, with Adidas, we're more in I'd say the communication as opposed to coming up with the jacket concept. But what we hope that we can do is if a brand came to us and said, okay, how are some other companies in a similar situation doing this? We can provide them some input, some reference points. And then if they say, hey, we want you to create something that's going to be appealing to the youth audience that we're trying to target 18 to say 25 in the first tier markets, what would that look like stylistically? Then we can actually co-produce some content that educates them about the brand heritage and gives them some stylistic sort of positioning that fits the audience they're trying to reach.
And that also applies for Chinese companies going international as well.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Sitting between China and America, do you see things that they've been in China? You've seen cultural nuances or things that are happening that would say, oh my God, this would be such the rage in the US if it was ever exported. And of course, I'm not talking about that annoying Misha ice cream and tea theme song that please do not export that dumb thing. Of what I was teaching at NYU, all my students were showing that video, and I just said, please turn it off. It's driving me crazy. That I love you,
it's an
you love me.
It gets stuck in your head song. For sure.
Yeah, I know. I can't get out of my head for like a lifetime. So besides that, is there anything that you see as, oh my gosh, this would just be the rage? Like, why hasn't anyone ever thought of that?
I mean, gosh, that's a good question. I'd have to think about it. I mean, look, I think not necessarily like that people haven't thought of this, but I just feel like there is a growing movement in terms of embracing Chinese cultural elements and then packaging them in a way that is, is appropriate for the international markets. I mean, one is this fragrance company, Guansha. I don't know if you've heard of them.
Great example.
But basically what they do is they take Eastern fragrances like sandalwood or like chrysanthemum or, these different fragrances that are much more prevalent, say in China or the East, but they're creating them into, diffusers, into perfumes, into candles. And, we take that for granted. Like, what we consume growing up in the West, regardless of our ethnicity, of our cultural background, has been dominated by Western sort of paradigms, right? But there are many things that, originate from the East that are now being packaged and commercialized in a way that could become very successful brands and products abroad.
Agreed.
That's interesting. Yeah, great stuff. So yeah, I know. I'm just thinking, just off the top of my head, my wife is now experimenting with tiramisu. She's actually she had oolong and molihua, the green, the tea flavors of tiramisu.
There you go.
She's trying to explain. No, it's incredible.
Matcha tiramisu.
I mean, who knows? Yeah. You're seeing it with Lao Gama, right? These chili sauces, and there's a company that I actually invested in long ago. It used to be a Genbing business. Now it's a chili crisp business called Mr. Bing. But it is the Chinese, chili sauce, the crunchy chili sauce
that's Ben's company.
Oh, Ben Duvall.
Of course.
Oh, good. So you know exactly what I'm talking about. Like, that is an amazing product. And now it's blowing up in the US, but it originated in China with all these different, I think there's plenty to be discovered and unearthed from China to bring to the rest of the world in many different industries. Yeah.
For people that love following culture, besides checking out your website, is there anything else that you recommend any influencers or any other platforms or ways that you can just kind of keep up to date on these things? Is there anything you'd recommend, Brian, that for people to check out? I mean, in addition to your website, which has a lot of great information.
I'm sure there's plenty of other channels that are emerging that, are covering culture, which I think is great, in terms of understanding what's happening in China. But I think the best way to do this, and nothing can rival this, is just simply coming to China for a week and coming to Shanghai or Beijing, going to maybe second, third tier cities like Chengdu, even Changsha. Like, there is so much going on. You talked about hip hop earlier. There are thriving musical subcultures in all these different cities. Chengdu, people probably know like Higher Brothers. They know Bohan Phoenix, but Chengdu was the birthplace of Chinese hip hop. And there's some really amazing stuff that comes out of there. Yunnan has an amazing reggae music culture. Many people don't know that, but we did a whole documentary on this for Radii about, the origins of reggae in Yunnan. I mean, it's a laid back, cool, like just really chill sort of culture that matches
drug-free culture.
Yeah. They grow that stuff on the side of the road. I don't know if you saw it when you were there, but it's everywhere.
Hey, we went to a bunch of cafes. Every cafe, but we went to a bunch of cafe after cafe, and then we just kept asking the coffee shop owners, and like, hey, do you know where? And it's not them actually; it's the old dudes on the street side. So it's the farmers, not the coffee shop owners.
And they sell the seeds in the markets, but I understand it's different types. Some have the potent, sort of what you're looking for. Others are just more for the hemp. But anyhow, it's got a lot of similarities. Then there's Wuhan for punk rock. You've got Shenzhen for EDM. Like, there are these pockets that, these subcultures exist in. So I think people really just need to come to China, see what's here, and experience it in order to really open their minds to just how diverse the country is, and also how creative, the people are here.
Great advice. Great suggestion. Brian, thanks for being on the show today. It's been really fascinating. I will put links to your article as well as the website.
Thank you.
Radii in the show notes. And I just think I think trend watching is just so much fun, not only to understand what the dynamics of China, but also how it's impacting the rest of the world. So thanks for being on the show today.
Hey, thanks, Bryce. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Ali. It's great to talk to you guys.
And thank you for joining us on today's episode. Join us in a few weeks for another exciting show. And to all listeners, until then, have a great day.